All right, welcome back to another installment of the Capital Conversation podcast. James and I are glad to be joined once again by Riley David, senior at HRA. Today we're going to be talking about the latest on impeachment and Rep. Van Drew, and then the latest on the Democratic primary.
Yeah, so touching on impeachment, there was big news this week as the House approved 2 articles of impeachment. They approved obstruction of Congress in that Trump is not cooperating with them at all. He's ignoring the subpoenas throughout this entire process. And then abuse of power, which again boils down to the whole Ukraine thing. And it's important to note, like we've talked about earlier, that they left bribery out of this because going into it, we thought that would be a big thing.
Well, the bribery spin has always been something that the Democrats have been pushing towards because it's one of the impeachable offenses specifically listed in the Constitution. So that if they can convince enough of the American public that that's actually what he did, it's incredibly significant because if everyone agrees that it was bribery, then there's no argument that bribery is not an impeachable offense.
Well, and it ties back to the whole, what they have now, there is question of, whether or not the abuse of office / power is actually a criminal offense and one that could fall under that whole high crimes and misdemeanors clause in the Constitution. And so they're kind of playing a dangerous game here because I think a lot of people have interpreted that as sure, something that shouldn't have happened, but not something that is a high enough crime to impeach a president. And then, if you don't believe that this process is, reasonable and there's grounds to hold the impeachment inquiry in the first place and that what Trump did is criminal, then it's hard to convict him on obstruction of Congress because if there's no crime, related, then you can't obstruct.
What I don't quite understand is, to what extent does abuse of power go that doesn't reach bribery but is still an impeachable offense? If you believe what he did was an abuse of power, how is it not also bribery? Because in the abuse of power, you acknowledge there's a quid pro quo, and if there's a quid pro quo, to me, it seems like bribery is sort of the next logical leap you have to take there. I don't understand how one can be impeachable without reaching the threshold of another, unless the abuse of power is aimed at something else, which I don't get the sense it is.
Right. It seems like they kind of, screwed up the wording here.
Yeah, and if you were going to pick one, I think you would go for bribery. Like you said, it's actually in the Constitution. I'm sure there's some sort of strategy behind it, but to me, it's just not making a ton of sense.
Yeah, when you're trying to make your pitch to the common people, you don't really want them to have to draw their own conclusions about what the language means. You want to make it very simple and clear to everyone, what exactly the offense is that you're charging them with. And so the way that they've set it up, it seems kind of difficult to make that case.
Yeah, and I think obstruction of Congress, again, is something that's not really going to matter in this because if you prove that he did abuse power, it doesn't really matter. And if Trump's counsel proves he didn't abuse his power and it's not an impeachable offense, then he didn't obstruct anything because all the charges are faulty anyways. So I just don't quite understand what the end game here is with those 2 charges. Maybe it's just the second one as a shotgun approach. We're just going to see what sticks, and if we can get him out of office, we will. But from a legal perspective, I'm not really seeing how this is supposed to line up for them ultimately to get him out of office.
You can still, correct me if I'm wrong, but can't you still obstruct an investigation even if it's not?
Oh yeah, I guess
if it
that's
comes
true.
out to be negative, even if they conclude it's not a crime, it can still be wrongdoing to interfere with
right, but I'm
legitimate
saying,
practice of a.
They made it difficult for Republican lawmakers to vote, in their favor on this issue because you have a situation where, if you don't fundamentally believe that, this process was justified and, that what Trump did was all that bad, or if you disagree with the way that the Democrats handled the whole, starting the inquiry and stuff like that, then you don't feel that Trump obstructed by not cooperating with the investigation, because if you believe that the investigation is faulty in the first place, then, that it's hard to can constitute that as obstruction. And, I think that most Republicans would agree that, this is not the best thing that a president could have done. There's clear wrongdoing by the Trump administration, same as we saw in the Mueller report. Again, clear wrongdoing, but it's just a matter of to what extent. And if they had phrased it in a different way and maybe in a better manner in terms of making it very clear what the constitutional precedent is here, it would have been a lot easier for Republican senators to say, on this exact ground, I'm voting to like remove from office. But now it's kind of like they have to do it on their own, and I don't think they're motivated to do so and risk hurting their constituencies.
Yeah,
So,
well, I think just like if you, like we agree, and I guess you don't, but on previous podcasts, we said that I think this is a political calculation, all of it. And if that's the case, then I don't think an obstruction of Congress charge makes much sense, because if you conclude Trump, is not guilty of abuse of power, and then he ultimately is impeached in some hypothetical scenario because he obstructed Congress in an investigation that ultimately proved him innocent, the American people are going to take that, and Trump's going to spin that to say, this was all a trap to get me impeached. I did nothing wrong. This is complete hoax. They just made me walk into this. They knew they had the upper hand, blah, 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 blah. And when you take that into account, there's no way they win the presidency in the upcoming election cycle. So even if that is ultimately what gets Trump impeached and it's not the abuse of power, I don't see how that helps them long term, because I think it makes them look shady as well, even if technically they're correct that it is an abuse or an obstruction of Congress.
I mean, I think the idea of like a president claiming that a trap was set for them in impeachment certainly has the historical precedent. Like when Andrew Johnson was impeached and then he avoided being removed by one vote, Congress set him up and put him in a situation where they knew that he would commit actual impeachable offenses. So you could certainly, and if you're President Trump, you may make the argument that that's what was done to you. So I guess I agree that putting the obstruction charge on there is a dangerous game to play.
Yeah, just as I'm working through it, I just don't see an avenue through which the obstruction makes a difference in him getting impeached. And if it does, which I think we all agree it's unlikely, if the abuse of power doesn't go through, the obstruction is going to get him removed. But even if it does, I don't think that's necessarily good for them in the long term.
right, and it's totally a package deal the way they aligned it, and I think it would have been smarter for them to give themselves two shots and force the Senate to take two different votes. I mean, obviously this will take two votes, but whoever votes for one is going to vote the same way in the other. But if they, attacked it from two different sides and charged him with two different crimes, like two completely different crimes, then they could have a vote on the, abuse of power, have a vote on bribery. I think that would be the most likely thing for them to charge him with. And then, whatever the abuse of office thing is attack on, or the obstruction is attack on, but now, they basically only have the one shot with that abuse of power, and even for the people that think he abused his power, I think that, a lot of those people could make the argument that it's not an impeachable offense to abuse the office of the presidency. I mean, presidents have been doing it since the presidency was instituted, so.
Well, it's a sticky situation, and especially I just don't see a Republican turning against their party in this particular instance.
Right.
But I think with the bribery, they could have.
Mm-hmm.
So not putting the bribery, I mean, if we think it's a political calculation, or even if you assume that it's genuine, the Democrats were doing it for genuine means, why not put the bribery on there? Why do you think that that's what they chose to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have a hard time answering that question. I mean, I think that I can see some sort of strategic aspect in terms of highlighting the abuse of office and that whole deal, just because, you can attack it in a vague manner and not get into the specific abuses, mm-hmm. and then, you could get a Republican lawmaker to vote on it from some example of President Trump's abuse of power that dates back to the beginning of his presidency. I mean, there are a lot of instances in which he's abused his power, and a lot of instances that have upset Republicans, and they've criticized him for it.
Certainly.
And so I think casting that whole wide net of it's not just this one instance, it's 3 years of abuses, mm-hmm. they might have thought that gave them the best chance, but I don't think it hurts you to tack on the bribery.
Exactly.
It's not going to make your chances of impeaching less, so that's the thing that's kind of strange.
Yeah, and with the bribery, I mean, like we touched on, you can say this is he's been convicted of bribery. It's listed in the Constitution, the same word, bribery. Thus, he has to be impeached. But without it, there's enough, political maneuvering and sort of glib wording and all this other stuff that can be done, even if, they say, yeah, he did this, that you can point out and say, well, it's not in the Constitution, so we're not going to do it. So I think they sort of painted themselves into a corner now, where even if they, I guess not prove that he did something wrong, because I think we all think he has at this point, but proved that it was something greater than what it currently is, I still don't think there's a way for him to be impeached, whereas I think if that word bribery could be tied into both the Constitution and the trial, there would be a better chance. So I think they've sort of done themselves a disservice there.
Well,
Yeah.
and it's rough in terms of precedent too, and I think that they should be wary of that. Like, if you're setting the precedent that, you know, a president abusing his power is something that then you can impeach and remove a president for, then I think that that's dangerous for many years down the line. Like, when a Democratic president does something that's, you know, constitutionally questionable and the Republicans don't like it, like, for example, the Affordable Care Act, now you could impeach a president over something like that. And I think that, I don't think people from either party want that to be the precedent.
Right.
I mean, I don't think it's fundamentally good for us to be constantly impeaching presidents over and over again.
Yeah, I think everyone would agree about that. And I mean, in your particular situation, if we start giving it up to Congress and House of Representatives to decide when a president has done something that's an abuse of power, if you define that as going beyond the Constitution, that strips a lot of the power from the Supreme Court, in that, that's the Supreme Court's job
To
today.
check the power
is
of the
to check,
presidency,
yes.
right.
Well, switching gears a little bit, we've sort of touched on the legal implications of this, but politically, it's going to have a big impact on the 2020 election and then the country as a whole afterwards. And we're seeing the first inklings of that maybe long-term shift come about. And like you said, New Jersey Rep. Jeff Van Drew is considering switching parties. He's currently a Democrat and has had a meeting with President Trump earlier this week. And he's thinking about becoming a Republican now. And he's been a Democrat who opposed the impeachment inquiry. He was one of two who opposed the launch of the inquiry at all. I think it was a couple months ago. So long term, does this indicate that the country as a whole, like even some more moderate Democrats like Van Drew, may be seeing this from the president's angle a little more? Or is this sort of just one guy acting out? And is it something the Democrats need to be concerned about going forward with this?
Well, it kind of ties back to that whole conversation we had about, you know, was this the right strategy in terms of taking up the articles of impeachment? And I think that a lot of the Democratic lawmakers are frustrated with the like Democratic leaders' strategy on this as well. And there have been a lot that have, you know, said like they need to think about whether or not they're actually going to vote for this inquiry or this like to impeach when they take the whole Congress vote. And I think it will pass, but I think that you're going to see a lot more than 2 Democrats vote against impeachment when it gets to Congress this time around. And you know, a lot have said that they would support a censor as opposed to actually impeaching. And so I think that Van Drew is the most like staunchly opposed inside of the Democratic ranks to this whole impeachment situation. But I think that a lot are not really pleased with the way that it's been drawn up, and I think that that really ties back to that.
Well, I think it's also important to remember, you know, Van Drew's particular instance. I think we were having this conversation earlier. He's not particularly popular amongst Democrats in his own district.
Right, he has 24% approval rating among
so
Democrats in his
maybe
district.
maybe he's just seeing an opening now to jump
Right,
ship.
and recently Governor Phil Murray and Senator Bob Menendez have both declined to endorse him for his reelection bid in 2020.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's clear that he needs help in order to be reelected in 2020, and if he can reshift and, you know, advertise himself as a Republican and get those, you know, Republican voters in the district to support him and maybe some of his previous Democratic constituency, then that seems like a more logical pathway to his, you know, a reelection. And so, you know, it's interesting whether or not he is actually genuine in terms of principle with this party shift, or whether it's something really to further his political career that is necessary.
I think it's probably a little bit of both, but it's also going to be interesting to see how Trump can sort of spin this beyond, like, if you think Drew is going to do this anyways, then it's not really a big deal. But if there's a way Trump can spin this to say, you know, hey, look, here's a reasonable Democrat who now is flipping to my side after seeing how, you know, unfairly I've been treated or all this other mess, then maybe it would have bigger implications beyond just winning, you know, one seat in New Jersey for a Republican. And Van Drew would sort of serve as, like, you know, the Democratic leadership is starting to move, and maybe you should too as a voter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Trump being able to have this argument in his back pocket is huge for 2020, because if he has actual Democratic lawmakers on his side about like it being a witch hunt and things like that, it makes it a lot easier for him to make his case to the independent voter when he's campaigning in 2020. So, if he can point to specific people in Congress that think that what the Democratic leadership did was wrong, it certainly helps him in terms of like if he is impeached, still going on to win re-election in 2020.
So I think the most interesting part of all of this is the way Trump has to spin it in 2020. I don't think it's that significant on a national stage that there's one representative from New Jersey that's flipping parties or even considering flipping parties. Like you guys mentioned, there's the bit about him saying that there's reasonable Democrats and it's not all Democrats feel this way, and kind of making the pitch that even if you identify as a Democrat, or even if you have Democratic leanings, you can go the other way, like it's okay, there's other Democrats saying that it's fine. I think that's an interesting angle he can take, but I think part of it is he has to try to mitigate the effect of the impeachment, because, I know there's people who think that impeachment will help him or could help him based off of what happened to Bill Clinton and how his approval ratings went up after he was impeached, but I think we've talked about it before, and none of us actually think that impeachment will be helpful for Trump if it proceeds the way it has been.
No, but he has to mitigate its negative effects. Like, there's a stigma attached to being impeached as a president,
certainly.
and there already is a stigma with President Trump, just being President Trump. And so, that certainly is something that he can't ignore when campaigning for himself in 2020, is
Certainly.
what just happened. And so, if he has a way to swing it positively, on his side by saying, like, it's not just us Republicans that feel like, this has been a witch hunt and people are just, set out against me and all that. And he can actually point to people on the other side that, Democrats might be willing to listen to, or at least independents, and not just think that it's party politics. I think that would help him.
Right, and I think it's going to be even worse for him than it has been so far. And I think part of the reason they worded it like they did with the impeachment and talking about abuse of power is that it's very clear that he's done a lot of stuff in the past that's going to be brought up that's not great, and probably most of it isn't going to be an impeachable offense, but it's all going to be really bad looks. It's going to be bad PR for him.
Yeah, well, they get the whole snowball effect. They get
Right.
When they talk about abuse of power, they get to say, he did this. Oh, and by the way, this, and
Yeah,
this.
you
and-
can talk about the emergency funding that he used to fund his border wall,
Yeah,
which
and
I
the
mean,
Mueller
that
thing.
was a lot more significant to Republicans.
It's just
Incredibly frustrating to Republicans, and
Right. I mean, Marco was absolutely furious about that whole
as they
situation.
should be. I
Yeah.
mean, any Republican should be able to see that this is a terrible precedent to set, and when you have a party that claims to be for limited government in the United States, it's really bad to have your president being the one to expand federal power. And
Right.
if you're a Republican and you support Republican issues, it's clear to you that the second a Democratic president gets in power next, that they may just declare a national emergency on climate change and
Yeah,
then
or
divert military
plenty of
spending.
other
Right,
things. I mean,
anything.
you and I have had this conversation about that scenario in House of Cards where, Democratic President Frank Underwood, does the exact same thing as President Trump, but on, like, the war on poverty and unemployment. And that's totally a policy that you could see a Democratic president taking up
Right, of
and
course.
saying that that's a national emergency, which he would have just as much a case as
As
Trump does
President
with
Trump does,
illegal
right.
immigration. And then, all of a sudden, government funding is, being taken away from something, FEMA, and being used to prevent, unemployment, which I think, unemployment is something that needs to be attacked by government policy. Probably, there are ways that it should be handled, but not through the use of, disaster aid.
Right, exactly. And even if you support Republican policy or you support Democratic policy, you can understand the nature of process and how things need to be done.
Completely removes the check of, the body of Congress with the House of Representatives and the Senate being able to, say that they don't agree with presidential policy
Correct.
and, voting no on it. Whereas now, like, a president just wants to do something, he can do it and just completely bypass that whole having to go through Congress.
Right, you move one step closer to the presidential king. And,
Right.
it's a disaster as far as checks and balances and maintaining a Republican form of government.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, even shorter term, just the impeachment gives Democrats in the Senate, I guess, a stage to dredge up all this stuff and make people remember, oh yeah, the border wall and the shutdown afterwards, and that affected me negatively, or or the Mueller thing, I remember that, and it just gives them an opportunity
Right, and plenty
to
of
dig up
people-
all this stuff right before the 2020 election on national television, which
had
is
their-
fantastic for
right,
them.
Had
And-
their lives upended by the shutdown. I mean, all those people
Yeah.
that are like relying on a government paycheck, they got back pay, but for people that are living paycheck to paycheck, just because you're going to get the check eventually doesn't mean that in
Right.
January you're living comfortably. I mean, a lot of people were kind of on edge, and every single day was hurting them
Right,
that the
and-
shutdown continued.
The majority of people in this country are living either paycheck to paycheck or close to it. Most people don't have massive reserve funds, and certainly if you're a federal worker, there's a low chance that you're going to be able to subsist off of what you have saved. And just this ability for Democratic senators and the Democratic Party to air basically the
Their
American public's
grievances.
grievances on national television could be impactful.
Yeah.
But at the point when the trial's taking place, which, I mean, right now is looking to be sooner rather than later, it may have an impact on the Democratic primary simply because of how many senators are still in the race.
Yeah, and that finally started to be, I mean, you and I, or, all three of us have made that point on previous podcasts, but, finally started to be a story in national news, that whole argument of like, you have Senator Sanders, you have Senator Warren, two of the front runners in the Democratic race for president that are, going to be obligated in January to be sitting in trial for, 5 to 6 days a week.
Right.
For full days. And so, what effect that has on the campaign will be interesting to see.
Well, I don't think that really breaks the hearts of too many higher up Democrats. I think they'd rather see a more moderate Democrat take the presidency anyways, and thus probably win the general election more easily than a Warren or a Sanders would. So maybe that went into some of this. I mean, that's stretching quite a bit, but
Yeah, but I mean, I also don't know to what extent that's true in regard to the higher up Democrats, because just looking at the four front runners, like, I don't think that they're ecstatic with Biden.
well, no, but that's why they talked Bloomberg into running, because he said, months ago that he wasn't going to, and then he got a couple phone calls. I don't know from whom exactly. They haven't really been published, but I assume there are people with a lot of swing in the Democratic Party who are worried with the direction of the party as a whole when it goes more progressive, and then with Joe Biden as a person. So somebody talked him into running.
Yeah, I
And-
mean, I guess that's true if he keeps huffing while all the Democrats are sitting in the
And that's another story.
Senate.
Bloomberg has been doing much better than I thought he would be. I kind of left him for dead at the minute he started the race, but he's been slightly ticking upwards in the polling. And like we've been saying, once those senators have to sit in, it gives him more of an opportunity
Right,
to
if he
get
can
out
keep
there.
gaining positive momentum, I guess I could see him climbing into the double digits. But my point is just like, I don't think that there's a strategy by the Democratic leadership to prop up Biden as the nominee, and I certainly don't think they would be doing that for Buttigieg.
Well,
And, I don't think they're doing it for Sanders or Warren either, but I think they're kind of staying on the back burner because, one, I don't think their constituency would be happy, especially after the whole debacle in 2016 with the superdelegates and Bernie and Clinton. And two, they're supposed to be the party for the common man, and so
Yeah.
if the elite leadership of the party is the one that decides the nomination, I think that would upset a lot of people. And so I think I think that they have positives and negatives about all four that are at the top, and that's not an ideal scenario for them, but I think that they're going to let it play out and hope that they can rally behind whoever is the one that wins.
Yeah, well, I didn't mean to suggest like they orchestrated it, just sort of going off the dome there, but I don't think they're too upset about it.
Yeah, I
think-
don't. If they even thought of it when they were talking about impeachment, I don't think it was breaking their hearts that.
Yeah, it's
It
a
might hurt
happy accident,
Bernie.
I
Right,
think is what they were
exactly.
suggesting,
Yeah.
which I don't think that's untrue. But I'm just saying, that leaves them in, I think, somewhat precarious territory. I think that they should be concerned about that to some extent because, like I said, I don't think that they regard Biden as, an untouchable and
Yeah.
super strong candidate. And I think
Correct.
that they have serious concerns about putting him up against President Trump in 2020. So if you basically eliminate Sanders and Warren, and, I think Buttigieg's campaign has momentum, but I still have a hard time seeing him winning the nomination. Then it basically becomes a one-horse race with Biden, and you have all your eggs in that basket, and I think that they're a little concerned about having that happen.
Oh,
It could be
100%.
bad.
So,
But at the same time, Biden has had a few major slip-ups recently, like we saw with the vote in Iowa, and it seems like no matter what the guy does, his polling only slips but so far. There's probably maybe 26% of the Democratic base who's going to vote for him no matter
Yeah.
what.
Well,
So that's
people-
encouraging.
Well,
for
it's
them.
hard to campaign these days because everyone is so set in their ways,
Yeah.
and so I
Well-
think President Trump kind of started that, and we, saw those polls like in jest and stuff like that about like he could go out in Times Square and shoot a guy, and
Mhm.
X percentage of his people that like support him would not flee from his support, and that is made as a joke, but it did have some bearing of truth in terms of the polls that we saw, and so.
Yeah, 100%. But when you look at, sort of, you have to go back a few months, but during the early months of the race, after one debate, for example, Kamala shot up maybe 5 or 6 points.
Yeah, but then
Warren
within a
and
week she
Buttigieg
had-
just moved, but Biden has never dipped more than 3
Yeah.
points. So I think that goes to show just like how loyal people are to him, and I think that's somewhat appealing to, Democrats just as a whole.
Well, I think everybody at this point in the Democratic Party, serious, the people who are actually going to be voting in the primary, understand that Biden is prone to slip-ups and
Yeah.
doing
This
things
is
that make him look
not
bad.
news, but
Right.
things that happen with Harris and things that happen with Buttigieg and people like that are less of household names, like that might come off as a surprise and could be a deterrent to somebody that would have supported them. But with Biden, there's no surprise, so if you were willing to look past that and say that you support him in the past, there's no reason for one more gaffe to change your mind.
Exactly, and I think a lot of people who throw their support behind Biden, and the people who are actually enthusiastic about him, not people in the Democratic Party who kind of view him as there's not really another moderate option who's super, super viable, I'll vote for him because I support his policies or I support President Obama. I think people who are interested and very active and would be prone to changing, they support Joe Biden because of what he stands for as the party and what he represents moving forward, not actually because of the person he is.
Right.
He's not a person who really draws huge audiences or inspires crowds, and despite his association with President Obama, is very different from him in that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, people were, super excited to go out and vote for Obama. We saw some of the highest turnout ever when he
Exactly.
ran.
Yeah.
And Joe has that same base, but at the end of the day, he's just not as young, he's not as energetic as Obama.
He's not as well spoken.
But it's
primarily.
kind of shocking, when you think about the diversity that was in that field, when it began with 25, 26 people, and they all have their assets, and I think that in terms of political experience, they had a pretty strong field, but it was just kind of spread amongst a wide array. It was kind of shocking to see how attached these African American voters have been to the Biden campaign just simply because of his attachment to the Obama presidency that they loved. I mean, Biden and Obama were not best friends prior to them running on the ticket together.
Well, they still aren't. Hasn't Obama still not come out and endorsed
He
Joe?
hasn't endorsed
Yeah.
it. But I'm just saying, if you look back at 2008 primary video from the Democratic primary, Biden and Obama got into it quite a bit, and they disagree on policy, and they're not the same person,
Correct.
and to suggest that Biden is Obama Jr. or something like that is just blatantly false. And so I'm just kind of surprised that simply because he was on a ticket with Barack Obama makes Biden somebody that's a shining figure for the black community. I would think that they would have looked at it a little a lot of these voters would have looked a little bit deeper into some of these candidates before just throwing their support behind Biden.
Well, if you look at the other African American candidates, the people who have really been trying to live or die based off the African American vote, and it was clear in the last debate, Kamala Harris is gone now, but when she was last on the stage, it was very clear based on her rhetoric that she was vying for the African American vote.
She'd done that on every debate. I mean,
Right.
her whole campaign, she was trying to pander to the African American vote and gain more of that, and she never was able to capture it. I mean, not even really a notable chunk of her support was from African Americans. But I'm surprised Booker didn't gain, or Castro hasn't gotten more support from the African American communities.
I think with Booker, part of it may just be that he doesn't give the same impression as being nearly as interested in African American issues as President Obama, or maybe the voters just have fatigue, but I do. I think it's strange that African American voters haven't flocked to him when I think to many people he shares the same assets that President Obama does as far as being very energetic and being able to speak well.
Yeah, I mean, he's not as elegant, but
Right.
but there certainly are parallels to be drawn, and I think that, like, when you listen to him, or you listen to Castro, or you listen to Harris, any of those, diverse members of the Democratic primary, when they're on the debate stage, like, it's clear that race and, equality are central to their campaigns,
Right.
and that is one of their biggest issues that they are behind. And I don't get that same impression from Biden. Like, I think for him, healthcare is central, and, he has the sort of like political shaping of a much more conventional presidential candidate, and it's not something like he'll answer a question about race, but it's not really something he wants to bring up on his own.
Right.
So,
Well, he doesn't have the best record in the past.
that's another thing. But for these African American voters that I think they felt like they've been disenfranchised for however many years by the government, like, it's surprising for me to see, like, when you have candidates that are directly coming out and saying, like, my number one issue is, more equality for, your race, and they're shying away from that and supporting somebody that is just going to have the same Democratic policy as Democratic candidates, at least in the 2000s modern era.
Well, I think that has a lot more to do with Barack Obama than Joe Biden. I think Barack Obama made that much of an impact on people, that much of an impression on them, that they were going to stick with him pretty much regardless of what he did. And I don't think Joe's done anything too flagrant to lose that. So I think it's just sort of a carryover effect rather than, black people being exhilarated to go out and support Joe Biden.
Well, I think it's interesting because I wrongly assumed for a long time that a lot of the buzz around Barack Obama was because he was young and he was well-spoken and he was an African American, and that's really what got the black community excited behind him. That same effect could be replicated in the future by someone who shared a lot of those same qualities, but I think we're seeing now where we've had two energetic African American
it was
candidates.
more about Barack Obama
Right.
than it was about the fact that he's an African American.
Right, that there was something truly special that managed to inspire people there and bring out the voter
Right.
turnout he saw, and that it wasn't just because he was an African American.
Well, I think part of it is when Barack ran, there was still that glass ceiling. There'd never been a black president before, and I think just busting through that made a lot of people excited. And now that it's happened, maybe they're like, all right, we no longer need to prove that, it's possible, or I'm sort of pulling at straws here, but I think the gist is, to me, that they no longer feel like there's something holding them back. And now that that's been proven as a, just a voting base, they feel a little more liberal to vote for who they actually feel like is the best for them, rather than just proving that a black person can be the president.
Right, but
Yeah.
they still aren't voting for the people who you would think would be best for them.
Right.
Joe Biden, I don't think anyone would argue that he is the best record or is the best candidate on African American issues. They're
Yeah.
voting for him based on that link to President Obama. So I don't think they feel free to vote for who they choose. I think they're still voting based on that Obama
Yeah.
memory, and I think it was something about him and maybe you're right about what he did and what he was able to shatter that glass ceiling, but the memory of that and that victory
Yeah.
keeps a lot of people energetic about Joe Biden and willing to go out and vote for him.
Well, we can think about it. I mean, how easily would Michelle Obama have won this Democratic primary?
It'd be a sweep. I talk about it all the time.
She might have won every state. I mean, if with all the baggage that's surrounding Biden, like, he still has this amount of support simply because of his attachment to the Obama presidency,
Correct.
then somebody that's like a figure that's almost universally loved among Democratic circles were to run, Obama's wife, I mean, God, she would have probably hit 60%.
She would have destroyed. The
Yeah.
primary would be probably almost over by now.
Right.
It'd just be a dominant candidate. You'd see a lot like 2016 where everyone assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win the primary very quickly and that Sanders didn't really stand a chance. It was a surprise to a lot of people how well he actually ended up doing.
Right.
Well, I think the one thing that might have held Michelle back is the fact that she's not, I think a progressive candidate maybe could have posed some sort of a challenge there just because the direction the party's going, or maybe that's a consequence of this latest round of, or this latest primary, but I think that there are some holes that people could see, like, you're not going quite far enough here or there, and, maybe
Yeah.
Michelle's big thing might be, I'm not just going to be another Barack Obama, I'm my own person, I'm this, that, and the other, and people might just want her to stand in there and do what Barack did. a lot of people
But
want.
Biden hasn't ran that campaign, and he's gotten plenty of support just from the Obama base. That's the one point. And the second thing is I think that there's definitely a decent chunk of people that are Warren supporters that support Warren on the sole basis that she's a female. And Michelle Obama has that as well, and so she could siphon some of those votes away from Warren, people that are less progressively inclined but want to vote for a female, and so they're choosing to support Warren. They would instead prefer Michelle. But the other thing is if you think back to 2008, like Obama ran an extremely progressive campaign, even in the general election. I mean, it was a progressive figure before the Warrens and the Sanders.
Right.
And so his presidency was not as progressive as he had campaigned it to be, but a lot of that had to do with the fact that Republicans won control of
Well, the
both
economy was
bodies.
also terrible in 2008, and it's doing pretty well now. So there was probably more progressive appeal back then for Obama to sort of capture than there is now, just because people were more desperate. So I
Right,
think you've
but
gotta-
I think that if she were in the primary, I don't think she would have any issue with
Oh, I mean, I'm
losing the
agreeing with
progressive
you.
vote to Warren
Well,
and Sanders.
I think she could capture a decent portion of the progressive vote. I think the Obama presidency, in a lot of ways, has moved the Overton window as on healthcare and a lot of other issues. And the fact that Joe Biden, who by no means in 2008 would have been considered a moderate based on the policies he's pushing now, is considered the most moderate candidate in the field. It's clear
Yeah, it
that the
shows where
window's
the
been
politics have
shifted.
shifted, yeah.
Right, and there would be room for Michelle Obama to run as an in-between of Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren or Senator Sanders, and trying to
Right.
occupy that middle ground and still be able to draw progressive votes who were excited by her, and also capture moderate votes who remember Obama and are fond of the family and fond of her as a person.
And I think that there's plenty of states that you can point to where there's a clear void and frustration amongst Democratic voters.
Yes.
In terms of like who the candidates actually are. Like if you look at states where in like South Carolina and Texas, like there are astonishing leads for Biden. Like he's up by
Right.
20+ percentage points in some of those states, and we haven't gotten great polling at this point because those are not the first couple of states to come around in the primary. So we'll have to see if that continues. I think it'll tighten a little bit, but at this point you'd be hard pressed to say he's gonna like win by anything less than double digits.
Yeah,
And if you think about the demographics in those two states, like South Carolina has a lot of African American voters,
especially in the Democratic Party, like
Right.
the main conglomerate is those African American voters.
Right, and then if you look at Texas, I mean, there's a ton of Hispanics there, and I think that those minorities, like we talked about, are flocking to the Biden campaign, but I don't know if they're like exuberant about voting for Biden. I certainly don't think that the 40 some odd percent that are supporting him are exuberant, but because of the lack of other candidates in the race, like Sanders is not getting a lot of the African American vote, Warren is not getting a lot of the African American vote, Pete is getting like literally none of the
0.0,
African
correct.
American vote. So if that's your top four, and you have three that are not attracting like any African American voters or any minority voters, it makes it pretty easy for someone that has a good record, or not a good record, but
A history,
like-
an association with a president that was adored by these people to
Right.
take that portion of the vote.
yeah. And so I think he's going to be hard to beat just in that regard. Like there are too many gimme states for Biden, and then if he can sneak in and win a tight state like a Wisconsin or something like that, then there you go. Like that's pretty much it.
I've heard people talk about the possibility of it coming to the convention and there not being, no one having a true majority. So you have Sanders at 30%,
Yeah, I
Biden
totally
at
can see
40%,
that.
and Warren or Biden at 45, something where Biden is the majority leader,
person, but doesn't have enough delegates. Yeah.
and then it comes down to the superdelegates, and I think it would be a very bad look if the superdelegates picked a
Yeah,
different
I think
candidate.
they'd be forced to throw their support behind Biden. But I think right now the biggest state to look at in the primary is California because that's polling very tight. I mean, we had 2 California polls come out in the past week, one from Capital Weekly and one from CNN and SSRS. And the Capital Weekly poll had Warren at 23%, Sanders and Biden at 19, and Buttigieg at 14. And then the CNN poll had Biden at 21, Sanders at 20, Warren at 17, and Buttigieg at 9. So, you have one poll where Warren's ahead and Biden's tied for second, and another poll where Biden is slightly ahead with Sanders in second and Warren in third, all within, the poll's margins of error. So I think those states like California and New York are the ones that you really look to because, one, like you said, like if it kind of spreads out, like if it's not one candidate or Biden that's winning all the states, then that makes it easier for him to have the most delegates, even if it's not enough to win the nomination. But two, like, if he can capture those states, I mean, then it's basically no contest because he has all the South states, he has that whole vote centralized, so,
It would be very easy for him. I've been under the impression that I'm beginning to see is mistaken, that the conglomerate who votes for Sanders and the conglomerate who's polling to vote for Warren are the same group of people, and that when one of those candidates inevitably drops out, that those
All the
voters will
support will
flock.
be, yeah.
But I think it's becoming more and more clear that they're really different groups of people, and you see how like a significant portion of Warren supporters tend to shift over to Biden, and you see how if you look at polling where they ask you who's your first choice and then who's your second choice, people who list Warren as their first choice are putting Biden as their second choice.
Wow.
And they're not, which it would change my mind, and it's challenged an assumption I've made. So
Yeah.
maybe,
Well, it's also curious, I
Right.
mean, when you think about ideologies. But I think, like, part of it with Warren, like I said before, is like when you have 4 frontrunners and 3 are male and 1 is female, and they've been pushing so hard to get a female in the office of the presidency, that you have plenty of, Warren supporters that want her because she's female, and she very much campaigns as a female empowerment candidate.
Right.
And so I don't necessarily see, like, if she were to drop out, which I think is highly unlikely.
no,
but
I think Sanders is far more likely to drop out for
Right.
health reasons or any number of things.
But if she were to drop, I think I could see half of her supporters going to Sanders, but
Yeah.
he certainly is not going to be able to centralize the entirety of her, constituency simply on the grounds of being a progressive.
Right, and I was making that assumption for a long time.
Yeah.
I figured, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, if they really want to see their policies pushed on a national stage,
One should drop.
one of them should drop
Yeah.
and try and consolidate their support. I think if Bernie Sanders were to drop, I think you would see a significant amount of his support going to Elizabeth Warren, just because he doesn't have that woman factor, and there's not the constituency voting for him because they think it's because he's a woman or because he might help women's issues, whereas there is that with Warren. So maybe it would help her if he dropped, but I think there's also a significant number of people in the Democratic Party who are a lot of like the Trump voter types who are attracted to that populist message and drawn to the Bernie Sanders ideology.
Right, well, I
might
mean, if you
move
think about
over
the
to-
economic policies of Sanders and Trump, I mean, there is plenty of similarity there.
Right.
But, challenges kind of, your point, which I think is an accurate one, some of like previously held fact in terms of, like many people would just add up the Sanders and Warren percentage and say like, Biden has an uphill climb because the progressive wing has this percent, around 40 to his 20. So
Which is what I've
when
been
it gets
doing for a while.
centralized, he's going to be dwarfed. But if people have their second choice being Biden that are Warren supporters, then that makes it look like pretty likely that he's going to end up being the nominee or
Yes.
the eventual winner by the party at the convention.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out. I think there's a lot of different ways it could go. I think we all think that, actually. And with regards to the impeachment thing, the Democratic primary, it's all going to influence how we look at the world in 2020 and then how politics function thereafter as well. So thanks for tuning in with us today, and we look forward to seeing you on the next installment of the Capitol Conversation.